Today, I'm going to be talking about the Balkans, specifically the history of tobacco in the Balkans. This video will be focused on how the tobacco economy affected and was affected by violent unrest near the end of the Ottoman Empire. So let's get started. Tobacco has a complicated legacy in the Balkans, often representing many contrasting things to different groups and people. The industry itself has funded plenty of development within the Balkans, but has also been used to destabilize the region and extract wealth. By the late 1800s, tobacco had become prominent throughout the Balkans, especially within the Ottoman Empire, which is a major producer of Oriental tobacco. Unfortunately for the empire's inhabitants, the wealth generated from the tobacco industry would not remain with them. In 1883, the Ottoman Reiji was established, a state entity responsible for collecting tobacco taxes to directly finance Ottoman debts to European banks. This foreign extraction of wealth caused unrest among peasants and tobacco workers, who felt that they should be experiencing the benefits of their tobacco industry instead of European financiers. This unrest was especially pronounced in Macedonia, which was already racked with anti-Ottoman sentiment and insurgent groups such as the Internal Macedonian Revolutionary Organization, aka IMRO. IMRO specifically targeted the economic interests of the quote European masters, which often included tobacco enterprises. But while the tobacco industry was often exploited to the detriment of the Balkans, it also promoted development for certain regions and groups. Bulgaria stands out in this respect. The country had developed a strong tobacco industry by the 1890s. Seeing the European domination of Ottoman tobacco, Bulgaria aimed to avoid a similar fate by practicing protectionism. Even IMRO, who took such a strong stand against tobacco in Macedonia, were largely funded by tobacco money, often from Bulgaria. In the IMRO struggle against the Great Powers, as in many Balkan conflicts, tobacco was funding both sides of the struggle. As the Ottoman Empire entered the second half of the 19th century, it was struggling. The empire was losing control of its territory, its sovereignty was being eroded by the Great Powers, and its economy was faltering, struggling to catch up with the industrialized West. At the same time, the tobacco industry began a slow but continuous growth, and the cigarette emerged as a popular consumer product. The Ottoman Empire held land prime for tobacco growing and could market their tobacco to the West as a luxurious Oriental product. As the tobacco industry grew globally, so it did within the Ottoman Empire. Ottoman official statistics claim tobacco shipments reached 8.9 million kilograms in 1880, 15.9 million kilograms in 1897, and 38.4 million kilograms by 1911. This growth should have been a boon for the decaying Ottoman economy, but with more economic potential came even more international exploitation. As the Ottoman tobacco industry began to take off in the last decades of the 19th century, private enterprises flourished throughout the empire, from Istanbul to provincial towns like Salonika. But, as the industry grew, the European great powers began to take interest. Quote, Oriental tobacco was growing in popularity throughout the West, with tobacco stores in the US displaying Oriental designs and names such as Fatima and Mecca. The Great Powers decided to capitalize on this trend by establishing the Ottoman Reiji in 1883. The Reiji was a regulatory body formed by the Ottoman Public Debt Commission, an organization dedicated to paying off Ottoman debts to European banks. The Reiji was run by Europeans and was designed to regulate the production of Ottoman tobacco, eliminating contraband and collecting tobacco taxes to pay off Ottoman debts. This direct European influence was clearly a violation of Ottoman sovereignty that challenged their statehood and drained their economy, but there was little the Ottomans could do to stop it. The empire was so indebted to European banks and politically fragile that any serious resistance was frankly untenable. What was soon abundantly clear about the Ottoman Reiji was that it was deeply ineffective. It struggled to enforce its regulation, with much tobacco being produced and sold outside of officially sanctioned facilities. Scottish author John Foster Fraser, while on a tour through the Balkans, describes his experience with cigarettes in the Ottoman Empire. Quote, the only cigarettes you are supposed to smoke in Turkey are the Reiji, the government monopoly, but nobody in Kavala ever smokes Reiji cigarettes. Every cigarette in Kavala is contraband, and it is good. End quote. The presence of contraband tobacco was widely noted during this period, pointing to the ineffectiveness of the Reiji. Much tobacco was smuggled behind closed doors, but seemingly even more often, contraband was handled very publicly. This is partially due to the Reiji officials themselves, who seemed to enjoy contraband tobacco about as much as anyone else. Journalist G.F. Abbott, while touring Macedonia in 1903, spent some time with the elites of drama, local Reiji officials. He says the following of their smoking habits, quote, "All these gentlemen, though officials of the Reiji, or perhaps because of that, smoked contraband tobacco, which is cheaper and better than the monopoly stuff," end quote. Clearly willing to ignore the rules themselves, many Reiji officials were perfectly willing to allow tobacco merchants to smuggle contraband if they got a cut of the profit. Despite the success of smugglers, the situation Ottoman tobacco producers and merchants found themselves in was not a good one. They either had to deal in contraband, which was still risky, or adhere to Reiji regulations, which concentrated on collecting revenue. Even more frustrating for many residents of the Ottoman Empire was that this revenue was going directly to European banks instead of staying within the empire. They felt that the Europeans, and the Ottoman government by extension, were sucking local profits out of the economy to finance debt elsewhere. The Ottoman Empire was already plagued with political instability, and their attempt to monopolize the tobacco business only worsened this instability. Journalist H.N. Brailsford, in a 1906 book, describes how, in Albania, contraband tobacco is sold openly with no regard for the Reiji. He wrote that, quote, "There were once branches of the Turkish tobacco monopoly in Albania, but it proved so easy to murder their managers, and so difficult to check the trade in free tobacco, that they have long ceased to exist," end quote. This sort of violent independence is somewhat typical of this period, during which politically motivated violence swelled in the Balkans, and, as Brailsford's observations suggest, this unrest was commonly linked with tobacco. The region most destabilized by tobacco was Macedonia. Macedonia was a prime tobacco-growing region, which made it desirable to the surrounding powers. The unrest in the region centered around Imro, but involved many parties, both domestic and international. What complicates the situation is that while Imro stubbornly opposed Ottoman tobacco interests, they were funded by local Macedonian and Bulgarian tobacco profits. Considering tobacco was so dominant in the Macedonian economy, its prominence on both sides of the struggle makes sense. Fighting for Macedonia was also fighting for its tobacco. This fits in with the idea that, while Imro's struggle was purportedly an ethnic one, it also contained social and economic elements. For example, during the 1903 Ilinden uprising, Imro targeted not only Turks but also Chorbadzis, notable Christian allies of the Turks, and when the Ottoman troops struck back, they included Greeks in their attack, who had nothing to do with the Macedonian uprising. But the largely urban Greek community was one of the wealthier Christian communities in Macedonia, meaning that the Ottomans had something to gain from targeting them. We can see the social and economic aspects of Imro's ideology and their anti-great power tendencies. In 1901, prominent Imro leader Goce Delchev wrote of the Sultan's atrocities and the, quote, "favorable disposition of his fellow tyrants, the European masters," end quote. But Imro's anti-great power inclination extended further than just rhetoric. Imro performed a multitude of kidnapping of Western missionaries, the most notable being that of Miss Stone, from which Imro received a ransom of $65,000. Due to its prominence in the local economy, tobacco proved to be inexorably tied to political violence and Ottoman repression. For example, during the Ilinden uprising, Imro bombed the Ottoman Bank in Salonika, a French-controlled bank with ties to the Ottoman Public Debt Commission and the Reiji. In addition, Imro kidnapped and otherwise targeted Westerners connected to the Reiji and the Ottoman tobacco industry. This tobacco-based violence even extended into neighboring Bulgaria, where anti-Greek violence occurred. Specifically, Greek businesses were targeted by Bulgarians and many Macedonian refugees. This business was often intimately connected to tobacco, as many tobacco facilities were owned and operated by Greeks, despite their relatively small population in Bulgaria. Throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, tobacco was a driving force in Balkan politics and social movements. Inevitably, since tobacco was growing to be one of the most prominent industries in the region, it was tied up with any social movements promulgated by the underprivileged, who tended to be non-Muslim Slavs. We see this in Imro's targeting of Westerners and Christians economically allied to the Turks. In addition, the anti-Greek actions taken by both the Ottomans and the Macedonians are often presented as an ethnic struggle, but considering the economic importance of the Greek community, especially in the early days of the tobacco industry, this violence seems to be economically motivated. Tobacco provided the Ottoman Empire with its last economic boost. even as the empire itself was falling apart. But tobacco is also what made the great powers more interested in the Ottoman Empire, leading to the creation of the Reiji. This European intervention did nothing to help the political situation the Sublime Porte found itself in. A large amount of Balkan tobacco circulated outside the Reiji, only further diminishing Ottoman authority in the region. Not only did the Reiji cause this smuggling, it also inspired anger towards the Ottomans. This can be seen in the Albanian tendency to murder local Reiji branch managers, and Imre's frustration towards the great powers, the, quote, European masters of the Ottoman Empire. Despite the positive economic growth it promoted, tobacco in the Balkans mainly caused destabilization and violent unrest, as European powers tried to seize control of the Ottoman economy, and the locals resisted. The history of tobacco in the Balkans obviously continues past this point, and the relationship between the tobacco industry and the communist governments of the 20th century is a rather interesting topic, but that would be a whole other video, so I'm gonna leave this video right here. I hope you guys enjoyed this one, and if you're interested in more historical content, please subscribe. See you later.